Motion to approve.
This is Antoine. I'll second.
All right, and all in favor? Aye.
Aye.
All right, any opposed? No. Lisa has volunteered graciously to kind of lead us through what happened. Gosh, it's like 8 years now, Lisa, huh? 7 years? The last APFO, and she's going to make a nice presentation for us and kind of try to share her lessons from what happened 7 years ago. I think it'll be helpful. So we have a little better understanding of what happens from now when we start to make votes. If not tonight, we'll actually probably be starting in earnest at our next meeting. But what happens between the commencement of our voting, our issuance of our report, and then what happens after that with the council and the executive and so forth. So, Lisa, let me turn it over to you. I know you're talking about trying to limit it to 20, but you have plenty of time, so don't feel compelled to set a timer on yourself. Let's just
Lisa, I gave you 40, so take your time.
Yeah, right.
I'm probably going to be like half that, but if people have questions or want to talk about what I'm saying, that gives more. So thanks for asking me to do this. Thanks for
Lisa.
Trying to share.
Let me interrupt. I'm sorry, very quickly. I'm getting a notice from Paul Wyckoff that he's trying to sign in. And Jason, if you can send him another link. He had intended to be there, I know, but he's trying to sign in and he doesn't have the link. So if Jason, you could send that to Paul Glykoff, that would be great. Okay, go ahead, Lisa.
Can you tell if my screen is sharing?
No, because it's not up on the board. It would
Yeah.
No.
Okay.
So Jason, can you give Lisa sharing? Okay.
She is the presenter right now. There you go.
Is it working yet? There it is.
Yeah.
There we go. Thanks. Okay, great. Okay, so in 2016, the last APFO review was called a task force. A lot of this information just on this first slide here, you kind of may recall some of these details from our first kind of history of APFO meeting. So I'll be brief. There were 23 members, there were 22 meetings, and there was a report by the county executive, then Kittleman, that was due in April of 2016 after we finished. And then it was almost a year.
So do you want to put it on presentation mode so it takes up more of the screen? And that way people who are watching can see it. So if you come down here and you hit that button. There we go.
Thank you so much.
Yep, you're welcome.
Okay, sorry, thank you. So these links are the executive's report, and then another link that within that report, there was a chart of like all of our motions. It was this amazing giant spreadsheet that Carla DiLorenzo did at the time. It was a lot of work. And I have that there. I can pull it up if anybody wants to see it, but I just wanted to put those in there because this slideshow and the bills I'm referring to are dropped in where we have documents on the county site right now. So you could go there and see those at any time. So I was saying the legislation was almost a year later, in July of 17. There were 2 public hearings on that legislation, not about 9 hours of public input. It was CB 61. There were 30 amendments. And then, as some of you may be aware, there was an administrative error on that bill where they actually passed an expired bill. And it was so crazy, it had to just completely be done over again. So then CB 1, 2018 became the APFO bill. And sorry, I've got something hiding. Let me move this. And there were 4 hours of public hearing then and 8 amendments. So they changed it more, even though they were just kind of redoing it administratively, but there were more things that got added. So then back to the task force. We had 8 presentation meetings, meaning of the 22 meetings we had, 8 were fully taken up with presenting data, like from the county and various third parties. And then the rest were the debate vote meetings. Now, the way those 8 presentation meetings happened was there were 4 And then we stopped and had a meeting where there was debate, but no voting for a meeting. Then we had 4 more. And then at the end of those 9 meetings, we started to have all the rest of the meetings were debate, vote meetings. And they were very specific. We had agenda on the ahead of time on what we were going to talk about to debate and vote on. And they had topics, of course, and allocations was one, schools were 4, roads was 1, new metric possibilities were 2, Columbia specific had its own, as you can see what's written here. The last meeting, what was really important, and I think we should do again, was the last meeting that we had was reserved to take all of the noted motions and voting and reasonings and review them. So like ahead of time, we had these documents and we would review them prior to the last meeting. Then the last meeting was reserved for any kind of questions, any desire to revote anything, which didn't happen. And then it was just editing for accuracy and making sure that the report was what everyone expected it to be. And that was very productive and helpful to have that last meeting be like that. I will say that in the past, in 16, the allocations issue is much different than it is now. We had to talk about Columbia-specific things more so than we do now. Like there weren't enough allocations that existed to even do the Columbia downtown plan that was being going forward. And so there was a lot of allocation issues. I don't get into those details. It's not necessary. We're not in the same world as we were back then. And I talk later about like what was different about what we recommended versus legislation. There were a lot of allocation issues, but that's all changed so much with what we're dealing now that I just didn't get into that because it's not relevant. But a lot of things that are really similar to now, like 4 debate meetings on schools, et cetera, et cetera. So,
Lisa, quick question.
Mhm.
How much time passed between when a motion was made and when the committee voted on that motion? Was it like instantaneous, someone makes a motion and then everyone voted
No,
immediately
you would
thereafter?
go-
Or was
you
there
would go
time to
into
do
a
research
debate.
and give it some
Yeah, you would
consideration?
go into debate. There would be a motion. You would go into debate, and every motion was different. I mean, you can imagine that the topics of debate would be lengthy or not,
Mhm.
depending. The giant school whale motion that I'll just discuss later, Karen, it took 7 hours of debate. I mean, it went over 2 meetings and took 7 hours of debate. And one thing I'll just mention now is that we had a very different setup than we do here now. We had 2/3 requirement to have a voting quorum and a vote. We could not pass a motion without 2/3 of the committee members, not even of who was present. And so in order to have a report be anything other than 3 sentences, it was becoming very, very difficult to get anything passed. So pros and cons of that, I'll talk about herein. But one of the things that led to was just adding and editing motions and redebating, because when you take a vote and you couldn't pass anything, and so you'd have to keep talking some more and adding some more things to the motions. So motions became compromising and multi-level. You didn't have a lot of motions that had very substantive changes singularly. Like, hey, let's make something 120%, boom, vote. I mean, it didn't go like that for the most part. They were multi-layered, they were compromised, they had things built in. If this happens, then this happens, and this all 3 things at once, yes or no. And so the debating was just extremely long. And I don't see as much need for that here because our quorum requirements are really different. And but I'll talk about some benefits I think we should try to espouse still within that. So sure, thanks.
Another question, so you had these different topics for the different meetings.
Mhm.
Did people, were motions circulated like with the agenda so that people could see the motions that people would make ahead of time? Or they were just made at the meeting, someone would come with a written out motion and they would make the
Yeah,
motion?
it was mostly just from the floor. I don't remember motions being in the
Like
agenda.
like in the, okay. I was just curious if those were circulated
Yeah.
amongst the group ahead
No,
of
just the
time.
topics were known ahead of time
Okay.
as to what was going to be discussed and moved and debated. Some people met without a quorum outside to talk about compromises, that even different sides of things would get together and try to talk about compromises, not just people on their own side trying to cohesively express themselves, but also trying to make deals, trying to make compromise, trying to figure out what would be possibly agreed upon, because it was hard to get anything passed without doing that.
So a question going back, you said that the Columbia, there was a lot of process that went along that with regards to housing allocations. We started off the APFO committee talking about, I think, roughly the 22,000 housing allocations that are left. And knowing that Oco by design, a big point of it is looking at the Gateway Activity Center. Are we sure that we won't have a similar conversation that you guys did with regards to Columbia?
Possibly. What happened was after the general plan was updated and then we had AFO, and then they went and changed it again and amended the general plan just to add allocations for the upcoming plans for Columbia development. This is way before all of the allocations changed from mostly character-based stuff to type of unit, type of zoning stuff that it is now. And they've changed a lot of the totals, as you know, from what they were, 8 years ago, 9 years ago. And that's all I meant, was that we aren't tasked with knowing right now that we need to change allocations to even get something done. Whereas you're saying that very well may happen again. But we actually knew and were tasked with having to debate this out and figure out what was going to happen. And I remember even the public hearing on the first AFO bill, there was a general plan update to accommodate the allocations for Columbia, and everyone testified on both at the same time. So it was a timing thing that I meant.
Lisa, if you don't mind,
Yeah,
just one response to that. Yeah, there's a lot of interest in downtown Columbia allocations. Prior to this committee, everything had hard caps. There were finite amounts that you could reach. After the committee, they introduced exemptions for affordable housing, which they were anticipating enterprise housing making a whole bunch a lot sooner in the cycle, to which there would possibly be some allocation issues, but since they had a complete open-ended allocation allotment because of that exemption, it really dynamically changed the maximums that could have theoretically occurred out of there. In reality, because of the economy and a dozen different other reasons, they haven't built as many enterprise projects as I think they were anticipating. But if that comes around this cycle, those pre-existing exemptions or changes we made to exemptions would come into play.
But that also has to go through the special exemption criteria, correct? Is that what you're talking about?
No, there was
He's talking about allocations.
there was an allocation provision in there which
Okay.
allowed the required or mandatory affordable housing allocations for any project anywhere were exempt from the actual allocation
Okay.
account.
Okay.
So that was quite
Right,
literally
I was thinking you were
open-ended.
talking about, I'm sorry, the school
Yeah,
advocacies.
the school test has
Thank you.
hearing
Yeah,
before it
thank you.
happens to be waived, right. So are the questions answered? Okay, thank you. So lastly on this slide, I think something we should retain is instead of having a big minority report, so to speak, in general, what they did last time was every motion had some notation about what it was about, what was voted on, and what concerns were expressed, which would, I guess, technically be like a minority position on every motion. But every motion you would see if you pull up the voting chart and whenever look at it, giant thing. It has written reasons of, what was voted on, what was debated, what were concerns that were expressed, or like maybe why it didn't pass, if it didn't pass. So like not just the passed ones, but the failed ones, like every motion had that, which I think was really very helpful because again, given the high quorum, there were a lot of good ideas that just couldn't quite eke past that requirement. And so what was nice to let the council see for legislative planning was, what came close and what were the reasons why people had a concern? And so it's just much more informative for our lawmakers at that point. So I made this little.
Can I ask a question there?
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
Guys, I'm really sorry I can't be there, but at least I'm happy to be able to join you. Did the council take advantage of that when they got to their deliberations, or am I jumping your presentation here and asking?
Oh,
that?
no, you're not. You're not jumping. Thank you for that. It's not like they all said how much or how in depth they read the thing. I mean, they always say they read everything, right? But I think that they seem to pay a lot of attention to what we had done. So I like to think that it had some effect and but like anything else, the public hearings were really intense, really long. There were a lot of groups that were espousing certain positions, and so they had a lot of influence as well. But I do think they read that spreadsheet because it wasn't hard to read. It was lengthy, but it was pretty bulleted and easy to understand. So I would like to think they probably did read it.
And were there things that didn't pass because of the quorum and 2/3 vote requirements that were ultimately adopted?
I do have a comparison here of sort of the substantive, not everything, because I mean, I'd be here all night, but I took out substantive things on the screen now as to what were our recommendations and what the final legislative passed bill ended up doing. So is that what you're asking?
Yeah,
And then
yeah,
I also have later
yeah.
a slide of like substantive failed motions that came like super close, but didn't quite get there. And I've kind of noted on these slides like which of those things I can let you know which things didn't get done. There were some parking lot things. We called parking lot the issues that we felt were not directly related to APFO or under that jurisdiction of that ordinance, but like we've discussed before, there are lots of things that come into play with what you're trying to do with goals in APFO that have other means of getting done. And two things that did happen since then were the state gave us enabling legislation for the county to have more local control over developer fees. So that happened. And the transfer tax went up. That happened. So, certain things did flow along those lines as well.
All right, I won't preempt you anymore, but thank you.
That's okay.
So on the kind of the how voting happened and the kind of the high majority, was that in the regulation or was that the committee decided that they wanted a 60% threshold for motions to pass? I thought
It was 2/3.
or 2/3, but
Yeah.
did the committee
It's not in
decide
the
that?
ordinance, which is why we can be different easily, right? But
Okay.
the ordinance, we had just such a wide spread of different people, and it was a large committee, 23 people, and the county had chair. They presented chair people, like we didn't elect chair people back then, and they were very prepared, like day one, like how they were going to help us with our procedures. And they suggested that. And we, went along and we regretted it. Like a lot of us regretted having gone along, but then it took 2/3 to change it, so we couldn't.
So that was a committee decision.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And if you don't mind me chiming,
It's okay.
there's a strategic factor. There were clearly a lot of land use advocates, pro-development, pro-resource, battling tooth and nail. And strategically, fortunately or unfortunately, the quorum amounts could either prevent a lot of changes to something you didn't want changed or enable a bunch of changes to something you wanted changed, depending if you had enough votes. So it wasn't an efficient way to do things, but it also tempered mass change of the regulation, which again could be good or bad depending how you look at
So I'll continue. What I did here was I just took what I felt were the most substantive proposals in the recommendations and talked about how they ended up in the bill or not. With regard to allocations, we suggested that required amounts of MIHU units, which should be exempt from that test, and that age restricted that included continuing care be exempt from that test. And then what they did with allocations with regard to these topics in CB1 was they did do the exempted required MIHUs from allocation tests. They added an herbal renewal unit exemption from the schools test. They did the 40% of the units in the project had to be affordable, defined as affordable to 60% median income. Pilot programs, payment and low tax programs, and some others were in this exemption list that the council then would waive at faux school weights after a hearing.
Yeah, and that was one of the things we talked about at the last meeting that I brought forward.
With schools, and this was our, 7-hour debated motion. And there's more in this motion than I put here. It was like 2 pages long. So, but the main thrust of this recommended school change was to open up at 110%. And over 110 to 115, you could voluntarily pay 2 times the current surcharge fee to proceed if you were closed. And then over 115 to 120, you could voluntarily pay 3 times the current fee to proceed if you were closed. Now, remember, our fees were a lot lower than they are now. So that may or may not be something people want to do.
Now, was that going to the specific school then in which the,
No,
okay.
it was just paying that much more in general in a voluntary way to shorten your wait at these other thresholds.
And how long did
Percentages.
what was the shortening that you recommended? How many years? Did it shorten it or just immediate?
It just opened up if you were going to pay
Okay,
that.
so you went from closed to, okay.
Yes,
gotcha.
yes.
But that did not obviously get passed
Yeah.
by council.
Well, right. So,
Right.
so now at the council level, they did not implement any suggestions to push even what they needed from the state to do more fiscal things, right? That ended up happening later. Their ability to do more fee changes happened later because you needed state enabling legislation to do that. But at the time that we made this recommendation, and then it was a year later that they started the legislation, there wasn't really an effort to try to make that happen. So none of these fiscal things got implemented.
So they didn't, the council didn't vote on that one because
No,
they didn't have the
because
authority to.
they're-
They needed to
exactly.
pass the separate enabling bill first.
Correct. There wasn't really a push to get that. And so when they started, they didn't have the ability to do that. And what they did instead was 105% elementary school and regions, 110 middle school, 115 high school. So as you know, that's what we have now. That's what they did. Another thing we suggested was to take the allocation and school weight combined and cap it at 5 years. And what happened instead was a very complicated, like, whole page of the ordinance. It talks about the various scenarios of how long you waited for allocations and adding the school weight max on. And if you never did, or if you had 1 year, or if you had 2 years, what the max that it could possibly be was 7. Like, if you had this really long allocation wait, they would only tackle 1 more school year. Like, that was the way you'd get to 7. The reason why you don't hear from then to now people complaining that 7 is crazy, right, is because it never happens. As we've heard, allocations are rarely, and especially in the last 10 years, have not been something that has held up projects, the allocation tests. They've been there, so they have not experienced that. And that's why we really talk about the max school weight, the max weight being 4. I know Todd did bring up an example recently. One of the things they changed had to do with something he mentioned where when you start, and we start at the concept plan, like, so when you start and you take a test, and then there's an annual test every summer. So, like, if you take it right before and then there's another, you might take 2 tests really quickly. Well, before, they didn't really have years. It just said number of tests. So it wasn't really a number of years. So they edited that a bit and they made it so that it was really years you were talking about when you were talking about the max weight. And if you do take the test right before, you could be a little more than 4. You could be a little less than 4. But everybody talks about this average school weight of 4 years. But the max could be a little closer to 5 if you ended up testing right around the same time. Could be a little less than the max if you didn't. So average is around 4 max for the schools. One other thing they did that I didn't put on here, sorry, but I realized this later, was we did not make a lot of recommendations that passed with regard to roads tests. But in CB1 versus the original AFA bill, this redo, that was the implemented bill, they did actually reduce the impacted area for traffic review 1 versus 2 intersections. So like there was a little tweak there that happened. So there was like a easing with traffic, so to speak, that happened with that. And nothing there has been changed since, as you know. So some failed motions of note were, we did discuss types of units.
Just to be clear, that's your failed motions, not through council. We're talking,
Oh,
we're
yeah.
talking the APCO committee. We're talking the APCO committee failed
Yes,
motions.
sorry, I'm
Okay.
kind of all over the place.
Yeah, yeah,
Like
just
the
wanted to make sure
bill
we're clear it
versus the
wasn't what
thing.
went to council.
Yes,
It was
so
what was still
when I
within
say
the committee.
failed motions, I do mean our committee and what didn't pass. So we did discuss trying to do something differently with units being different, units having different impacts on roads and schools, et cetera. Now, we were more interested in allocations having a more direct effect on that, so that's where we focused that conversation. And something proposed was, you know, 1/3 for an apartment, 1/2 for a townhouse, 1 for a house. I mean, I know that people are interested now with maybe approaching something like that with regard to schools, because they're thinking that different types of units produce different amounts of students. And that was something we had brought up. But I just wanted to let you know that last time, like, yeah, 3 to 18 just wasn't even close.
Can I ask one more clarifying question? So 3 to 18, but then you have 11 to 7, so was that a passing motion? Or
No.
It should be 7 to 11.
It's not 2/3.
It's not 2/3. It wasn't 2/3.
I guess I guess so.
Is that right?
You would have needed 12 then, I think, right?
So
Yeah.
yes,
Because it was
okay.
18,
So
you
3
needed
votes.
12.
Yeah.
So-
Like they're all failed totals.
Okay, okay.
And hence the emphasis on it. You could have things that seemingly had
Yeah.
broad level support, but still
And-
died because of one vote.
And there was a
Okay.
period of time where we had more members and then less.
I see.
Because we actually did, and I'm sorry for the timing of some of these might look a little funky, like math-wise, like how'd that not pass?
Right.
It's because in the very beginning, we had people who like never even showed up, but it took us a long time to ask County Executive Kittleman to ask that person to leave. And so
Okay.
it's a little, you know,
Right.
different,
Gotcha.
different amounts of members in the beginning than at the end. And
Yeah, that's.
And it was 2/3 of everyone that was on, it wasn't,
The
like you
original
said,
committee.
it wasn't like the
and it
people
wasn't who
present.
was there.
So you
It
really
was,
needed.
it wasn't who was present.
So you needed like 15.
You
if
needed
had
2/3
23rd,
of the whole
16.
people on the committee to have a quorum, to have a passive vote. No, and so there, I can't tell you how many times we would talk and couldn't vote at all because we didn't have a quorum. We didn't just not meet if we didn't have a quorum. We just didn't vote. A lot of things were different. Yeah. Thank goodness it's so easy to have a quorum now, right? I don't have to worry about those things. So I'm, you know, because everybody seems to have a lot of interest in this and asking a lot of questions, I will go ahead and pull up that wild spreadsheet if you want me to, when I'm done, because I am almost done. But just to go through these, we've discussed a little bit recently in this committee to spend the fees near the project, near the school, whatever. And we talked about that in a general way, and you can see if it was 1 to 15. And I think the county was kind of really pushing at that point. They didn't really like the idea of restricting budgetary issues. That just didn't go over well. But we have talked about that here, trying to think about doing that. So I thought I'd mention that.
No, but
The-
you have I guess my question was, you have 7 votes in favor and 11 opposed. I guess I'm looking at the numbers, or, and not the 2/3 thing, but I guess it's looking
I
at
think
the.
it's 3 in favor, 18 opposed.
No,
so
they're,
like
they're,
11,
they're
7.
in favor and opposed.
Yeah.
Like
So
they
the
did
4 of
not,
them were 1
yeah.
vote away.
It was in favor,
Yeah.
18 were opposed, so 11 were in favor and
Yeah.
7 were opposed.
yes.
Oh, okay.
All of these votes have the in favor vote first
Okay, all right.
and then the
okay.
opposed. And so I brought these up because if you look at the
It still failed,
the
okay.
spreadsheet and we talk about
Yeah,
in that
okay.
chart between the recommendation and the legislation, and I had the substantive votes that passed, because, there weren't a whole lot of substantive votes that passed. But I kind of was listing them and saying what the legislation did, but I kind of wanted to also point out to people that there were a lot of really close votes to passing, but we were just 1 or 2 people off,
Mhm.
depending on the timing of it, that we just couldn't get it done.
And so you had 25 people on the committee. And regardless of the amount of people there, if you had a vote, you needed 2/3
It
of
was
total
24,
committee.
23,
So
at some
that
point it
means
was 23, yeah.
17 people. You needed 17 yes votes to
In the-
pass it,
In the
regardless of how many
beginning, it
people were
was, I
voting.
think, 24, then at some point it was 23, but close, you're close.
But it didn't matter how
You're
many
close
people
to
showed
accurate.
up because you always needed 17 or more to get a vote.
Exactly,
Yeah, okay.
yes,
I'm
exactly.
sorry, that just took.
That's
me
like,
back.
I know, it's
Yeah.
like mind boggling, like it was, believe me, it was frustrating. It took 7 hours to do that school thing, it was a little crazy. But anyway, so yeah. We did not really discuss adding a lot of metrics to APFO at the time, new tests, other than the ones we have, right? Except very brief shutdown discussions
There
pretty
were
quickly.
votes,
They were
but they
brief, like we talked about health, we talked about the ER. Back then, we thought we had ER problems. Anyway, but the fire, right? That one got some traction because the fire chief at the time, Butler, he actually came in and was kind of wanting a change, but then he came back and said, never mind. So the whole thing was really crazy. But that's when we really started talking about fire mitigation and talking about response time and maybe using that as a metric. And that didn't, 11-7, close, but no.
I feel like a lot of these things are the same things we're talking about
Yeah.
now. Like again, count relocatables
Mhm,
as capacity. I mean, that's the same thing.
Yep.
We're still talking about
Yep.
these same issues. Or similar.
Yeah. Now, the roads test was exempted for minor subdivisions, and we proposed to not have them exempted, but that did not pass. At some point, it was thrown up to just say that 120%, if you were at 120 or more, you should increase the max weight. And that came really close, but did not pass. And we, like Linda's saying, that we did have that same discussion about capacity and relocatables, but that was a no starter. No, people did not want to see that happen.
Do you recall, was the 120 at any level? Or was it at a specific level?
It was 120 or more.
Right. Or did-
Elementary, middle, or high school.
Oh, it
at-
was
Yeah,
everybody.
at any or,
Well, we didn't talk about high school much. We were really, there was no high school test at the time. The council added a high school test. We did not have any agreement to add a high school test or have any measurements be made with high schools. So we were only talking about elementary school and middle school.
so this was, if you're over 120 at either or,
Right,
elementary, regional, or middle.
yes.
Okay.
That's my recollection. I don't remember the details going further than that, but I can check the chart and see if I'm right. Go
And
ahead.
what, Lisa, was
Yeah.
the regional elementary test, was that a council ad? Or was that something
It
that you all
was.
voted on?
We didn't, Brent, maybe
It
you're,
was a modification to an existing
okay,
AFO thing. There were regional tests in the prior APFO.
okay,
There was a desire by, I won't name their names, a desire by administration to implement adjacency tests. And adjacency tests had a mathematical flaw if you were on the edge of a county.
Mm.
If you're in the center, you got 8 schools around you. If you're on the north part, you only got 2. And it started creating some weird double counting of the same benefit for multiple schools. So it eventually got so complicated, it kind of defaulted back to its original
I
configuration.
remember that now. It did get complicated. It made sense in theory to talk about adjacencies versus regionals, because it's like, well, what if you have an overcapacity school, and then you have a really undercapacity school right next to each other, and that's not fair. And so we tried to come up with adjacencies. I remember the council talked about this at length, and like Brent said, they kind of gave up and left it at regional.
Lisa, what is level of service D to C?
Level of service is in the road traffic survey. You'll have a level of service, like how many lights you might have to sit through with
It's just about
traffic.
time, yeah.
And they rank those A, B, C, D, E,
Yeah. that's
failing, whatever, right? And in many areas, service D is considered a passing
right. Yes.
grade of level of service. And so there were, in the growth areas where they were expecting the most new development from the latest general plan update, because remember, when we did APFO last time, the general plan had just been updated, and we did APFO like pretty quickly after that. It wasn't a big delay. So we knew and could think where a lot of new development was focused and planned. And so in that, we're calling the growth area back then, we wanted to, the motion was wanting to have that be a C instead of a D.
Which is counterintuitive in some ways, because actually you would think more congestion is indicative of more growth, and that's okay, because that gets people out of their cars, and you want them then to be more transit oriented and walkable, bikeable. That kind of forces that. You should not have a level of service A or B in your downtown area. That means it's
Right.
free flowing traffic. You really don't wait for traffic lights or anything
Mhm.
like that. I mean, that's just kind of the nature of an urbanizing area.
Sure,
And
sure.
just of note,
They-
there was an improvement from F to E that eventually found its way into code. And downtown Columbia is using critical lane volume numbers rather than the service levels, which are slightly different in the way they're applied and have a lot of tie-ins to things like the road plan, which had metrics embedded in there, which were referenced by that. So it was by osmosis
Yeah.
that some things got changed indirectly, not under the auspices of APFO, but
Right, otherwise.
other items that tied into
Yeah,
it.
but really A, B, C, D, E, F is just how long do you wait at kind of like a light cycle and intersections and things like that, just seconds.
Sure. The thought process from D to C was, it wouldn't tie up, it wouldn't say you couldn't do a project, it wouldn't make a project wait. That, remember, these are triggering mitigation. So the thought was, okay, we're gonna have a lot of growth in this area, let's trigger mitigation sooner. But that didn't pass, and sort of the opposite happened in the actual legislation. That there's this chart in the APFO ordinance where a certain number of trips and levels, and it will trigger the project having to do a traffic survey in an impacted area of either 1 or 2 intersections or more, and what was changed and added how many you had to see trips to trigger 1 versus 2 intersections was made small, but less. It was less. So that's the only thing that I could really find that really even happened in that bill.
On the mitigation, if it's triggered, is that then the developers,
Yeah, I mean,
they
there's just,
cover the cost of the mitigation?
it depends on what it is. I mean, sometimes it's XLD selling, it's light signalization, it's a whole bunch of different.
But they will cover the cost of it?
Yeah, and the idea is, it's to maintain your level of service,
Yeah.
not necessarily, some to kind of improve it, but the traffic study it's not to make things worse, but,
Yeah,
to
keep them-
maintain and improve
Okay.
if that happens.
And two other kind of ghosts that overshadowed all this was mitigation fees, which weren't directly in APFO code subdivision regulation. They were handled separately as state authorized. They kind of have remained stagnant since the last 10 years. And also, pardon me, right behind us,
Sorry.
fine resident is Route 1. And almost all Route 1, well, all of Route 1 is a state road. which meant they default went to service level F, much to the joy of the
So they
residents,
default what they,
to service level F.
so that's okay.
Worst service is okay, and the logic is, it's a state road, a county law cannot control a state road, but then again, almost every state project has some kind of county contribution to it, so
Yeah.
go figure. Right now, left untouched for the last 10 years, so.
Can we get back to
Thank
the motions, like it's just the process? So, I mean, hearing obviously the fact that there's such a high threshold to pass a motion last time, you know, made it very difficult to get anything passed and led to a lot of debate and led to a lot of meetings and negotiation. Just to put on the record, because I think we'd established this at one of our initial meetings, for us, we have a much lower threshold,
Yes.
right? We voted
Sure.
at one of the very first meetings, and it's
Mhm.
just a simple
Simple
majority.
Yeah.
And so that's what's gonna govern us moving forward.
Yes.
And that is a simple majority of only the people who were present at that time, right?
If there's a quorum, yeah.
If there's a
Yeah,
quorum,
we have
provided
a
there's a
quorum,
quorum.
yeah.
Yeah, okay, so I just wanna,
Yep.
as I'm thinking through those issues and thinking what we're about to
Yeah.
embark upon,
Yeah,
I just wanted to put that on the record for the benefit of all of us and for anyone listening, that it's gonna be a lot different in that regards this time around.
sure.
Well,
I
one-
do,
one question there, if, God forbid, but there may be certain things that we're gonna deliberate on over a number of meetings prior to the vote. Do the ultimate voters on the motion have to have attended the deliberations leading
No.
up to that vote?
there were no requirements at all, no.
Okay,
That was rarely a factor either.
Yeah. Yeah, the people making the motions were typically pretty present.
But you also said we could revisit a motion.
Yes.
So it's feasible moving forward, we could vote on something that passes, and then someone makes a motion to revisit that vote, and now we could have a potentially
I
a
mean,
different group of
Robert's
people.
rules, you could actually do that. It didn't actually
Didn't
happen.
happen last time, I was thinking it
Yeah.
happened this time.
I think what happened more was because motions failed.
Yeah.
Not that we wanted to revisit past ones and change people's minds or bring some new information to the table and take up more deliberation time. It was more along the lines of seeing some of those close votes, but they just couldn't pass. We would revisit them and say, well, how about if we put this in the motion, or, you know, did some compromises, like I was saying earlier, or having multi-level issues in a motion to try to get more people on board with passing it. We tried that a lot. And as you can see, the only really substantive one that worked along those lines was the school one, which had a lot in it. It had asking the school system to have budget promise things, and it talked about transfer tax. I mean, there was a lot in there. So, okay, as far as presentation meetings, we've had more, and I don't think we have as many meetings left to say that we would have as much deliberation
We're done.
time as last time.
I mean, this was it, I mean, this was.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, I don't want to be a hypocrite because I'm trying to be brief, but it's like, let's stop the presentations. This is my presentation. So we do need to be careful that any further presentations need to be brief. We really need to, I think, reserve most of the rest of our time for debate. Now, luckily, our debating is not going to be as time consuming, I think, because of not having that difficult threshold to meet. I would say that I think one of the benefits of it was that it forced us to try to compromise more. So you did get a little bit more balanced viewpoints in these motions, which was nice. And to that end, we likely have mathematically, position-wise, what people seem to want. Probably the ability to vote without an enormous amount of debate, without a lot of compromise. You will have singular changes in motions that are going to pass in this committee, I believe. But what I would suggest, because in the end, we all want the council to look at our votes and our suggestions and think that they didn't just pass by one or two people and then not have as much, importance placed on them. as we could, if we actually did get more of us to agree on something, it would carry more weight as advice, in my opinion. So what I'm suggesting here with lessons learned is maybe procedurally, Todd could just ask people, do you have some suggested compromise motions versus throwing out singular motions right away? And it's going to become clear very quickly if that's not desired. I mean, if a couple compromises are presented with more than one thing happening, things happening in two directions, so to speak. I could give you examples if you want, but I think you know what I mean. And they're shot down, then we don't need to waste time. This is what the majority wants, then that's what's going to happen, and we can move from there. But it's just a suggestion, because I do think that we should at least try to have
We're gonna be talking
as
about that later.
as much of
We're
an
ahead.
agreement as we can. But thank you. This is pretty much it here. And then I just wanted to remind administratively that, and if other people have notes, and remember parking lots that we have currently suggested, maybe let Linda know or Lisa County know to add some. These are the ones I had in my notes.
So did I have this? So send those to me. But there's going to be opportunity for that.
Yeah,
I only had a couple.
Everybody.
Those I didn't have, so thank you for bringing those back
Sure.
up. But okay.
Okay, so that's it. And I mean, unless anybody wants me to bring up the chart or has more questions about the previous task force conversations, that's all that I had put together.
Was there any
But-
limit on timing for debate for a particular motion? 10 minutes per person or something?
No, everyone was pretty concise. I mean, they called on people. It was all in person then, so you could pretty much tell who was raising their hands when pretty easily. They allowed people to speak more than once. They allowed people to kind of respond to people who were talking about what they had just said. It was fairly productive. I mean, I will say that I think that this committee has been just really nicer as far as there hasn't been arguments or anger. There was a little bit of arguing and anger in the past one, but even with that contention that I haven't seen here, which is nice, even with that contention, when it came time to debate and vote, people did respect the process and everyone got heard. And that's one of the reasons why it took a long time. And it were hours and hours of debating the big topics, because the administrators really wanted people to leave, even if they were disappointed with the vote, they didn't feel like they weren't heard.
So, Lisa, for both you and Brent, I mean, you've had the benefit of the process of the APFO committee, and then that rolling into a council bill that ultimately crafts the legislation that passes. And then 7 or 8 years after that to see how it all plays out. In retrospect, looking back, are you satisfied with, I mean, I guess you are because you came back from more of this torture, but are you satisfied with how that process went and then how it's played out since then? Or are there surprises?
We've talked about something that is the root of, I think, what makes people feel like things aren't working. As you know, you only can delay things so long, and then projects proceed. So the school system has not been able, financially mostly been able, to make a capacity difference that would then make capacity easier with more students coming. And so I really was very pleased that this committee seemed to talk even sooner than last time about fiscal issues and about even thinking about how do we pull fiscal issues to get, like, how do we get more money? Because money's what's driving all of these things. Money's what solves the problems for the most part, right? Especially capacity problems, and how do we get more money? And what's difficult is you've got a set of folks who look at the increase in the fees and don't want to make it any harder or any more expensive. And you've got people who say, well, time is money. They very well may be willing. You make it a voluntary thing. If they can proceed faster, or if people can do something differently, then they'll be willing to pay more. I mean, that was the one thing that I thought we had proposed before, which was an easier thing to do than now, because like I said, fees were a lot less. But that was the one disappointment for me personally, was that was not something that got managed, discussed, changed in any way for a really long time. And for such a long time, only kind of recently fully implemented now, that it didn't rake in over time enough to make a big difference.
And were you, and I'll include Brent in the question, have either of you been surprised that, I mean, obviously there's was a considerable amount of discussion and deliberation on the issue of allocations, which have been completely irrelevant. Is there surprise on your part in that respect?
Could you reframe that? Surprise.
In the last APFO was forecasting. I won't say targeting, because I don't know that necessarily the last master plan was labeled as aspirational as this one seems to be. But the last one was anticipating 14, 15, 1,600 units a year, and we never come even close to it. So is there surprise on your part that that's been what's happened since the last APFO passed?
So I'm going to look at it holistically. Granted, I've been here my whole life, and I got relatives who've been here much longer. I went into that expecting to fix one of the major flaws. The schools were overcrowded, and we didn't have enough resources, and we were exacerbating the problem over and over. To some degree, COVID hit, economic conditions hit, lack of land hit, and holding out for future rezoning hit, which has created a artificial dip in there. I don't believe it's APFO, because all the dips seem to follow national trends as opposed to a Howard County trend related to APFO. To that note, here we are in 2025. We're going to be looking at how do we get rid of the trailers? How do we catch up with capacity needs? And there's still problems. It is less of a problem because of things like the increased mitigation fee that came out, but other things have been left untouched for inflation, and inflation has gone up significantly. Anyone wants a new Ford Mustang knows that they're $30,000 more than they were last APFO session. I'm also going to throw out, I tend to represent schools, but roads, parks, police, fire. Our fire stations had to be half-sized and delayed. Everyone likes to go to the ribbon cutting for the new fire station, but they don't realize, it's 3 bays instead of 6 that was originally planned. We are not shown response time maps to get the public a little more engaged in there. Same for police. Police is a little harder of a measure. It's usually a per capita item. And you look at, I was on a solid waste committee. Everyone calls it the recycling committee. It's all green and happy, but it really was dealing with solid waste and trash and how we're going to handle it. Right now, we just ship everything out to King George, and no problem. No long-term planning needed. But whenever that King George pipeline dries up, we're going to have a very significant capital budget item regarding solid waste disposal and recycling. And they're literally debating it to a packed house downstairs right now, just dealing with minor amounts of that. So to answer your question, the outcome of the last APFO, I can see minor improvements, but I also see a long ways to go till we reach that sustainability, that steady state of adequacy that we're expecting. And yeah, there's new conversations. 10 years ago, they weren't talking about APFO as a unit count expectation. That just is something that came up in this cycle. Affordable housing really was barely discussed through the whole APFO deliberation phase, right up until they re-voted on it and decided to add it at the very last minute. So I still see trailers. And yeah, a few of them are for storage and a few of them are for office space, but we still have a long ways to go. I never had to go to school in a trailer, and neither did my father. And we didn't have schools when my grandfather was in school, but you get what I'm saying.
Yeah,
So-
no, I know, I get it, and I mean, there's so much there. There's so much macroeconomic and national trends in there, obviously, and then there's local trends that are issues as well. Lisa, I'll give you the last thought, and then we'll move on because I think Jeff is gonna present a couple of things for us.
Yeah, thanks. I'll just answer your question real quick about allocations and any disappointments there. Allocations used to be a little more heavily regionally based than they are now. And my concern is that, you know, before you could really, I used to call them the secret sauce of planning, like, was that you could make a certain amount available in a certain area. And that if that area was really crowded, you could shift them. The council every year could do what they wanted with this allocation chart. And the way that the categories were, where they were very regionally based in locations. And there's some of that now, but there's also now some more of the type of unit that's desired to be had, and they have allocations now and affordable in more general terms. So what I would really like to see happen is to somehow address these regional issues. And as the committee talks about, well, what do we do differently in super crowded areas versus not as crowded areas? Can we differentiate? One of the things that resonated to me so much in our public hearing last year, was people talking about, well, not every unit is the same, and not every place where a unit is the same, but it's one size fits all in FO. And that's where I'm hoping that we can really get some compromising conversations going. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa, for putting this together and
Sure.
and stimulating some thought. Really appreciate it, and Brett for your comments as well. We'll come back to all of this, and we'll come back to it actually for a few minutes later on tonight after Jeff finishes up. But for now, let's change directions and turn it over to Jeff for a little bit.
Okay, thank you, Todd. Turn this on here.
So I asked Jeff to kind of present tonight about, you know, the county development potential, looking at our land use that we have in Howard County, looking at HOCO by design, and looking at really what's left to develop and where, looking at how our allocation charts are used. Because I look at those as our guardrails. You know, we have the school adequacy test, and then we have the allocations, which kind of set by geography and by typology of what we're developing. So I thought, you know, kind of now that we're in this decision-making process, I thought it would be good to kind of see where we are today as opposed to a few months ago. I know we talked about this at the beginning of some of our discussions, and then here's an interactive map to show you as well, showing where we have left to develop. I mean, part of it is just natural. We don't have a lot of developable land left in Howard County. We're naturally running out of land. A lot of our opportunities will be redevelopment opportunities, and they won't be the same type of development that we've had in the past. We're going to be developing more multifamily, which will be naturally different than single-family residential, so there'll be more multifamily high-rise potential for our redevelopment options that we'll have, which, as Jeff has shown in the past, are less student generating than we've had with our traditional single family. We'll see more of that student generation coming out of our turnover from our traditional single family than we have from our new development that we'll see coming online. So this was just something I asked him to put together for tonight, updating some of our numbers and showing you where we are today. So as we get to our decision-making process, you can kind of see real time where we are. So with that, Jeff, I'll turn it over to you.
Sure, thank you, Linda. And I promise to keep this short, following what Lisa just said. You guys have had too many presentations already, or a lot of presentations. So this will be short and quick. You've actually seen this before, much of this before, except it's now been updated. So back in August or early September, one of the first few presentations kind of gave an overview of capacity, land use capacity in the county and what's in the pipeline. We update that annually each year. So since then, we recently updated these projections. So now we have what's happened in 2024 and the latest capacity. So it's really an update of where we stand, as Linda has mentioned. So to go over this, and I presented this recently to the Spending Affordability Advisory Committee. They like to look at these statistics each year also to kind of look at what's coming forward in terms of residential units and also commercial development, so they can have an idea of how the new growth will impact tax revenues, and particularly the one-time revenues like transfer tax and school surcharge that Lisa mentioned, and road excise tax. So this chart shows the history of building permits in Howard County, and you can see growth has slowed. We do have 2024 in here now. So there were 891 building permits built last year, which was an increase over the last couple of years, but still relative to the past, it's been somewhat slow, about 1,000 units a year on average since 2019, which is when the last APFO committee had met back in 2016, and the law first went into effect. The change to the law went into effect from that committee's work in 2019. So growth slowed in part because of the increased schools testing, the more strict schools test, adding the high school test, and also the county is running out of land. There's just not as much land available for development, and so the opportunity is less. So you're going to see less growth over time, and that's what we've seen. And there's expectations that will continue moving forward under current zoning. And this chart shows the same thing, but by building type. So it shows that apartment units, condos, and rental apartments are more frequent than they've been in the past. You can see the blue chart shows single-family detached homes. The land available for those types of homes, the zoning isn't as much, so we're getting less and less of those built per year. Those homes typically have more impacts actually on the schools because they have more students coming out of those homes. And so the impacts of APFOs on schools is less actually with increased apartments. And that was evidenced by some of the information that in the school study that Linda referred to that I presented on before. And also, if you recall, the projections done by the school system when Tim presented, school enrollment is expected to be flat moving forward for the next 10 years, which is a big shift from the growth that has been, occurring, pre-COVID pretty much. This just shows the building permits issued in 2024. The size of the circles represent the number of permits issued. There's a lot of development up in Turf Valley, some redevelopment in the Columbia, downtown Columbia area, and some other places in the southeast part of the county. And what this shows, when I showed this back in August, the capacity was about close to 20,000. So now this year, a year later, we have the capacity left in the county of about 18,000 housing units. And the various stages are shown. So the permit means basically anything under construction being built at the time when we did this snapshot in September 30th of 2024. And what's unbuilt, that represents recorded lots that could have building permits soon. And the in process is what's being reviewed by our land development division in DPZ. And so those are plans that are under review. Once they get approved, they'll take the APFO tests, and if they pass, they'll be able to move forward.
Jeff, what's the red bar? Is that, I'm sorry.
So the red at the end is the total. So basically it's, if you add up all the blue.
So is that essentially build out under today's land use and zoning ordinance?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
So Jeff, as I recall, when you presented this to Spending Affordability a few weeks back, the relevance of this for APFO is really important. And that is that those three categories of permit, unbuilt, and in process, which represent roughly half of the inventory to be built still, let's call it 20,000, 145 minus 126. But only 10,000 of the units that remain would be impacted by the new APFO, right?
Pretty much, that's correct. Yeah, so the permit, unbuilt, and in process is sort of what's in the pipeline.
Correct. Okay.
And
That's
now, it could be that some of those in process haven't taken the APFO test, but the majority probably have already. But, so I think you're, it's generally correct to say that it's really the 10,000 or so units that any changes to APFO would impact.
but to caveat that, this is prior to any higher density rezoning that is considered and passed by the council subsequent to Howard County HOCA by design.
Exactly. That's a really important point. And I was going to, mention that. So for example, this is the capacity based on current zoning. And I know Brent has raised this issue on several occasions to really point this out. So based on current zoning and based on our estimates of redevelopment potential, which are just estimates, but we try to do the best we can to figure out what that would be. So for example, a big portion of the undeveloped is redevelopment in the downtown Columbia area. That the downtown Columbia plan was adopted and the zoning was subsequently changed to allow for that new growth. Not all of the plans have come in for downtown Columbia. 2,000 of the 6,000 units have been built. And so the remaining 4,000 would be part of that 10,000 units. Yes, so then,
Okay.
APFO, the schools test would be taken once those new plans come in at that time. But yeah, so Gateway, for example, that Gateway master plan, which is moving towards, adoption this spring/summer, that could have, Linda, what are the scenarios? I know that were presented.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on, with a rezoning, maybe, an estimated of 6,000
Yeah.
roughly units.
So it's similar to so it's similar to downtown Columbia. So this doesn't include that. And it also doesn't include comprehensive rezoning, which would, with the intent of trying to achieve the policies in HOCO by design.
Which would be more of the missing middle housing and the activation of activity centers, which would have some, a little bit of, more residential development and the I mix, which is the industrial mixed use, which would have some residential components to it.
Right. So, and then if you recall on the presentation for HOCO by design, and the allocations in HOCO by design, the intent of that was to keep the same pace of about 1,500 units per year. So the capacity, I think, in HOCO by design as envisioned and tested, if the rezonings were to occur and Gateway were to be implemented,
Correct.
The total was 30,000. So that's one way to look at it. We have 18,300 here under current zoning. And the potential, and again, it all depends on the rezoning, what happens with rezoning. The potential could be, an additional, 10,000 or 12,000 after that. That's just something to keep in mind. But that hasn't happened yet. And by the time that happens, these things take time, meaning the Gateway Master Plan may take time than the rezoning. The APFO could be looked at again also. That's the other thing to keep in mind. You can't.
Well, it's every 5 years we're supposed to not a new code,
Right.
and then 10 years is a new master plan.
Yeah. But now I think APFO should be focused on currently what the current zoning is at this point.
Correct.
Okay. So let me go on with this. This shows the same thing. It's really showing that currently in the county, there's about half single-family detached homes. And in the future, there's only going to be about 27%, again, based on current zoning, and the apartments are 62%. And if you think about the Gateway Master Plan, for example, which would mostly be apartments, also some townhomes, but mostly apartments probably, that percentage will increase. So the future of the county really is looking at more multifamily mixed-use development based on the land use that's available currently. What this shows is just the total capacity over time since 2018. So back when around the last time that last APFO committee implementation went into effect, there was, close to 25,000 capacity. Now we're down to 18,000. And by the way, so even over that time, there was rezonings that occurred that added more capacity. So even though we've been building units, we've also been adding capacity. I think an example of that would be the Erickson development, where there's 1,200 units of age-restricted units in Clarksville. So that was rezoned to build that community. So that would be added to the capacity. So generally, the capacity, if there's piecemeal rezoning, which there hasn't been for quite some time since the last since HOCO by design, capacity is also added to the county moving forward. I presented this at the Spending Affordability Advisory Committee. It's a good leading indicator. So what this shows are pre-submission community meetings. That was added as a requirement, I think, beginning in 2007, that all developers, when they want to propose a project, and even before they submit it to the county for review, they have to hold what's called a pre-submission community meeting in the community at a public location and advertise on the website and invite the adjacent property owners to come to listen to a presentation of what they're intending to do. And then they have up to a year to submit a plan to DPZ. So this is a good indicator of what's happened in the past in terms of activity and numbers of meetings, and how that's changed over time. So the average was, since the beginning when these were required, was 41 per year. But since 2020, it's dropped to about 25 per year. These are meetings. The more important slide is this slide. So these are the number of units in those meetings. So how many units were proposed in these pre-submission community meetings? And the average was about 1,300 per year, but lately the average is lower at about 800 per year. And that's what we're estimating is the county, the average used to be about 1,500, and more than likely, moving forward, it's going to be between 500 and 1,000 new units built per year. And you saw that in the first slide that I showed of building permits. They were all less than 1,000. They're all between 500 and 1,000. And just two more slides, and then I'm done. So this shows the land use in Howard County, updated from the time you saw it before, so September 30th, 2024. Not much left in terms of undeveloped land, 6.6%. And just to point out that the county has made an effort to preserve land through agricultural easements and environmental easements, primarily in the rural west. And that's, that's permanently preserved, so development can't occur on that land moving forward in the future. And then Linda mentioned we have a land use map, and then we created a really sort of neat app with some talented people in my group here. And what this shows, this basically is a map of all of the projections in the county. I'm going to try to shrink this, I think, make this. Let me try to fill this so it fills your screen if I can see it right. You can hopefully see it clearly. So each of these dots represent one of those 18,000 units that I mentioned, and it's mapped in the county. The smaller dots represent single-family detached units, and the larger dots represent apartment units. And so you can see we added the APFO allocation areas. So if you recall during the presentation for HOCO by design, the allocations are given out by these APFO allocation areas.
Jeff, can you make that a little bit bigger? Zoom in, you're at 78%, maybe make it like no, actually your frame at the top. I don't know if you can see. Can you make yeah, there we go.
Is that?
Maybe it makes it a little bit bigger.
All right.
Yeah, that
Sorry about, yeah, my screen's sort of wide. Let me,
If you can get rid of the land use underneath, I don't know.
yeah,
Okay.
that's not very helpful.
Okay, yeah, no, okay, all right, never
All
mind.
right.
This is a little hard to see.
All right. So I think when I zoom in, so basically, if you turn on these APFO allocation areas, you can see, the growth is really concentrated in these areas. These, downtown Columbia is here. That's a APFO allocation area. And then a lot of the TOD areas, this is yellow. So this is the Dorsey area. Down here is Laurel Park Station, where there's been development planned for quite a bit of time. So you have a lot of apartments and townhomes built there. This is the Savage, some development in the Savage TOD. So the apartment projects are being located in these areas as intended. Of course, this is Gateway here, and that's a large activity center. And once that plan is finished, there could be potentially, units there once the rezoning is done for that. So that's what we talked about before, but more units could be added to the capacity. This application, you could like high school districts can be overlaid on it, which is helpful to see. High school and then middle school, so all the different levels can be added to it. And then elementary school. This on the bottom shows the number of units projected by year. And then you could filter through it. If you change the unit type, you can just say, okay, where are all the apartments? And it just shows the apartments. And you can show that they're located in the activity centers. And then, for example, townhomes, they're pretty much all in the east, nothing in the west. And then single family detached, you can see there's, these permits. And this also includes unbuilt. So if you just turn on the stage here and you just want to look at what's permitted, that's basically the number of SFDs that are permitted. Is that right? In the county. Yeah, so that's what's planned to be built or currently under construction. So it's just an application to show the projections in a way that people can dive in and kind of see how it works and what we're looking at.
Jeff, can we make this available to the committee to be able to play with?
Yes, yeah, certainly. I can put the link actually maybe in the chat box. Yeah.
Or can you send it to me so I can send it out to them? Because
Sure, I
the
can do
ones
that.
that may not have the opportunity to get that.
Okay, I can do that.
Okay, yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah.
We just thought it might be a helpful tool so you can see as you kind of make your decisions, it might be helpful to see what we have left and where. So Jeff, I think one of the things you didn't really kind of mention is more explicitly is, are we using our allocation? So if you look at the allocation chart, do you have that from HOCO by design, or can you pull that up quickly? If not, I can.
Yeah, I don't have that quickly.
And so I guess the thing is, are we using that allocation chart annually?
Right, and we're not. So the HOCO by design allocation chart has a lot more units in it than we're allocating. And so what happens is that if they're not used a certain year, they roll into future years. We're allocating again between 500 and 1,000 units per year. The APFO allocation chart is 1,500 units or more. And so, yeah, and Lisa mentioned this also. Allocations really haven't been used to the extent that they're in the general plans, the previous general plan and the current general plan, and so they get rolled over into the future. They were an important part in APFO, and there were units held up in the allocation span in, I guess between in the 90s and probably through 2012, 2013, something like that. But the last 10 years or so, maybe 2015, the last 10 years or so, they haven't been used. They haven't put a cap. They serve as a good guardrail, but they're not fully being used currently.
So that actually goes to a good point, and we can cut you loose. But we're hearing about an unmet latent demand for housing in Howard County of, say, 30,000 units in the next 15 years, give or take. But you're showing estimates of 500 to 1,000 units per year. So the demand is there. We're not supplying it. Are we not supplying it because the nature of what we can supply, given our land situation, doesn't match up with the nature of the demand? Or is it because the regulatory environment is so slowing our delivery that we can't deliver what the market wants in a timely manner?
Right. I mean, that's a huge question. And I think the main reason is because of the limited land supply and the zoning. The regulatory environment also is part of that, right? With higher fees and with a stricter APFO. People may not want to be able to assemble land if they know they have to wait 5 years before they can build. So it's definitely an impediment, but it's also an impediment that the amount of zoned land isn't as much as it had been 20 years ago. The county has finite land. You know, single family detached, for example, I mean, you can redevelop apartments perhaps in areas along the Route 1 corridor, but the question is, if there's a demand for more single family detached homes, you can't zone more land for that because there's no space for it, right? That's why the future is showing redevelopment in most of the apartments, I think. So to answer your question, Don, I think it's both. I think it's both limited land supply and the regulatory environment.
Thanks.
So just to put in perspective what Jeff was talking about, and he was talking about the allocations, this is the chart. And when we're talking about allocations, this is the chart that we're referring to. So Jeff, you know, kind of going back to what we were talking about, did you put out in your analysis, like, what are we taking from each of these annually? Like as far as downtown Columbia activity centers, other areas, rural west, are we hitting the targets on any of these?
No. So we're currently in the 2027 year, and we're not hitting the 1,400 unit target.
And what about for the individual?
So I'd have to look, but no, none of the individual caps have been met. So in the rural west, I think there's been 30 allocations,
Plus.
30 of the 100. And this is just going by memory. Other character areas is a few hundred.
Mm-hmm.
The activity centers is less than 600. So whatever isn't used come this June 30th will be rolled into future years. So I think if you add up the 1,400 times 2, which we've been in the second year, 2,800, we probably used about half of that.
Is there supposed to be a correlation between, I guess, two questions. I mean, is the goal that you want 1,400 houses a year, or this is the cap to stage development so that it doesn't exceed? Right? What are we talking about? Like, is this, do you want 1,400 units, or this is really to be a guardrail so that we don't overuse our capacity at schools and roads? And so that's the first one. And then 2, is there any correlation between the 20,000 units you're showing from 2026 to 2040 and the about 20,000 units you were talking about 10 minutes ago that were left to develop in the county? Are those supposed to tie in any way, or that's just a coincidence they're about 20,000 each?
Yeah, I mean, I think for the first question, so it's turning into an aspiration. I think Todd used that word. So it's also a guardrail. It's intended to limit growth by these areas, and it's been utilized this way since the 90s, and it really has been a cap because the growth exceeded the allocations in the past. Now we're at the point where, because growth is slowing since 2015 or so, it hasn't been used as a cap. And so when we were doing this HOCO by design, people started using the words like aspiration because we have the demand for the new housing. So it does provide guardrails. If there was a big project that came in, it does put a cap on it, but it hasn't been met in recent years. And if your point of view is we need to meet the market demand, we need to solve the affordable housing crisis, then in that case, this could be looked at as something as an aspirational goal to have these 1,400 units per year.
But just two things too, it's also sets it by geography too, so you can also pace development geographically as well, because parts of these are geographically based. So activity centers, downtown Columbia, rural west, and other character areas are geographically based, where then typology would be your affordable housing column.
Anywhere.
Right, that you meet the criteria for the affordable housing column, yeah.
And the way these roll over, I mean, and have they been rolling over so much that these numbers are almost meaningless at this point, that, you know, there's no way we're gonna hit them anyway because they're rolling over from year to year.
Right, that's a really good point too. So when the last general plan was adopted, it was like a 10-year plan, so 2010 or so, 2012 to 2020. The rollover was getting very big. And so it created a concern, because then in any year now, you can have a lot of units. So the county council actually, knowing that the next general plan was coming up, which is HOCO by Design, around 2018 or 2017, amended APFO to limit the rollover to only 10% of the unused allocations. So they did that, and so the roll, and I think they might have gotten rid of the previous ones. But that law had an expiration date on it. It only intended to serve as an interim sort of extra cap or guardrail until the next general plan was adopted. And so when HOCO by Design was adopted, that provision expired. But when HOCO by Design was adopted, the new numbers started and the cap disappeared anyways. So the very first year was 1,400.
And they could come back and do something similar again if they see that it's building. But again, what's capping the usage too is the school capacity adequacy tests. So
That's
correct.
That's where things are failing.
Exactly.
I have a question about a slide. The slide that's right before the pie chart one, I think maybe third to the last. Well, I think you were talking about the units related to the meetings. It looked like in 22 and 23, there were these bumps that were higher than this lowered average. That's
right.
Listing. And I wanted to ask about, is this with regard to phasing? Like, it looks like there's low, low, high, low, low, high, low, low, high. And like, is this a trend issue with coming out of waiting bins, or is this phasing, or what would you attribute that to, Jeff?
Yeah, well, these are pre-submission community meetings. So it could be that one of those years was Erickson, for example, 1,200 units. It could be that there were some big apartments proposed in 2022 or 2023.
Those are just pre-project, so nothing's
Pre-project, pre-submission meetings. So subsequent.
Okay, that's why it's such a big difference than permits. Got it.
Yeah.
You could have X number.
So they have up to a year to bring in their plan. So
One of those was my neighborhood, which is 550 units.
Wow.
One in probably 2021 is my guess.
Okay.
Because that's 700, I think.
Yeah.
If I had
You can make that
500,
bigger, Jeff, yeah.
yeah.
but that project, the developer pulled the application, and so it never happened.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Jeff, one quick question before we continue. If you look at the rural west column of 100 per year and a total of, I want to say 15,000 on that column, is there really 45,000 undeveloped, developable acres in the rural west? Because it's 3 acre zoning.
Well, 100 times 1,500 units.
1,500 times 3 acres per unit for gross density calculations, you need 45,000 acres.
Yeah,
Is there really 45,000 acres out there?
No, so I think the reason it was 100 per year is because that's what it had been in the past. We've been seeing like 30 and even less lately. A lot of the land.
Yeah, I mean, it just seems like there's no way to get anywhere near that number.
Yeah. I mean, it used to be we would get, 100, 150 units a year in the rural west, but you're right. It's definitely slowing down now as more land is preserved. Yeah.
All right. Anything else, anybody, or should we move on? Because Linda needs to chat a little bit about where we go from here.
If you'll humor me, and I know I tend to talk, I'll try to keep it brief. We'll kind of walk through an exercise right here. What does the allocations unit chart get for us? It serves multiple purposes. It's multidimensional. One is geographical. There's state regulations requiring a county to implement growth management plans and have geographic areas for smart growth. The only thing is it's implying that wherever you're moving the growth to, adequate infrastructure. And that's the other aspect of what we're here for, is just flat out moving something to somewhere else doesn't imply you have enough resources at that place. So we need to look at this from a multi-factor point of view. Like you said, there are limits and aspirations, but there's unlimited items embedded in these charts. And to the point that we're running out of land, I saw, what was the project you just mentioned out off 108?
The Erickson?
Erickson is a good example of things starting to nudge past the water sewer line. There's a lot of acreage out there that still could flip over the next years and decades, depending on legislative efforts. But ultimately, if we're looking at this unit allocations and going, oh, we don't need it, we aren't using enough of them, it isn't doing its job, well, that's okay. It's there for when it is needed. It is there when you can build 6,000 units a year and the market goes crazy and immigration comes up and all those great factors. And if not needed, it sits dormant. But we want to make sure it meets our goals. Is it meeting the goals of smart growth? And if so, are those goals actually making concurrent infrastructure as we're doing it? We're just assuming it might be there and in hopefulness. So please look at these allocations very closely, and let's make sure they meet the mission of what we're trying to do as a committee here. Thank you.
Thanks, Brent. And Jeff, as always, thank you. It's always just insightful to hear from you. So let's move on, which is just how we're going to prepare for now our next meeting, where we are going to start voting. Linda and I have had several conversations, and I'm going to turn it over to her to talk about what we'll ask each of our members to do in anticipation of those deliberations starting in our next meeting, which is 3 weeks from tonight, if I remember correctly. But
Yeah, March 12th.
yeah. So Linda, fire away.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. All right, nothing too exciting, but so bringing back the parking lot. So Paul, thank you for that suggestion. So again, kind of getting back to what Lisa said earlier about, kind of making some motions and kind of getting some ideas on the table. We're pretty much done with the presentations. The only other thing that we will have to have a discussion on, because it's part of the general plan implementation of HOCA by design, part of what the housing affordability work group was charged with and what they need to bring to you is kind of going back to that allocation chart and that discussion, is to talk about that housing affordability column. And so there will be a decision that they will make a recommendation to you, that you will make a recommendation about that column and how it should be utilized moving forward for the recommendation. So that will be the only other thing that will be brought to you at a future date. But I think one of the things.
Do you have an idea when they're going to bring that recommendation to us? Like how far in their process are they in coming up with their recommendations?
They will be bringing it to you probably toward the end of March. Yeah, mid end of March. So not the 12th meeting, but the meeting after that, which would be. I don't have the date off the top of my head, and I can't think that far ahead. The 26th, I believe. Then. So that meeting, they'll bring it to you. And we also need to decide when we want to have our public hearing. We had kind of a tentative date, but we have not gotten that far in our deliberation. So I think in all fairness, to have a public hearing, we have to have something for the public to react to. I think it needs to be your list of recommendations that you would have in your report that would go to county council. So that's what our public hearing would be on. But we're not there yet to set that date. So we need to be a little bit along in our process before we can set a public hearing date. But to get there, one of the things that Todd and I have been talking about was kind of taking that parking lot and making this the list of what you would like to see as motions of where you would like to head. So kind of back to Lisa's idea of where you would like to go with all of this. What are the things that you'd like to be voting on moving forward? So if you could have that list to us by next Friday, then what Todd and I could do is take a look at that list in their totality. And some of these recommendations and how they would be moving forward, we would like to organize them because some of them can stand on their own, but some of them may be predicated upon other motions that came before it. So just making sure we have them organized in such a way because, we can't have the excise tax if you haven't done this first, so there might be some things that we would have to organize a certain way. And then we will bring all of them to the committee to say, okay, here's the start now, but where do we want to go? And how do we want to move forward from here? So that was the idea.
What we're trying to accomplish is to limit the amount of go back work that Lisa was talking about, where we try to organize this as best we can so that we can address issues as sequentially as possible. So we don't have to go back 3 meetings and deliberations and then take a revote on a revised proposal. To the extent we can avoid it, we'll try to avoid it. We may not be successful in some instances, and so be it, but we want to at least be respectful of everybody's time and attention, so we're not doing all of that go back work.
Todd, are you guys thinking that you'll have topics for the voting meetings to kind of limit the motions to topics in agendas?
Yeah, the objective is to take everybody's list that we'd like to see in Linda's inbox by the 28th.
Mm-hmm.
And then we'll have basically Linda, 10 days, 12 days before the next meeting. And we're going to try to organize them and create a deck where it's as sequential as possible. So there might be like entry-level votes almost where we know that there are issues that some members would like to address, but there may be votes that we'll be taking and we'll be organizing so we get a sense of the committee. If we have a committee vote that would then preclude going to a detailed vote on another motion that's listed, it'll enable us to just say, not cross it off necessarily, but we know it's not as likely to even come up if we already have a vote that says that there's no reason to take that motion because we already have a motion that's passed that would preclude that next motion from being relevant. I don't know. We're going to do the best we can to try to make that work. But it's important that every member get their list together of ideas and thoughts of what they think their motions are and get them to Linda by the 28th so that she can start that process.
Is that what you meant by topics? Or were you thinking more like, we want to talk about school adequacy, or we want to talk about, do we want to add an additional test, kind of going back to the survey topics? Was that more what
Well, yeah, because like, for instance, we're going to be waiting for the Affordable Housing Task Force to give us recommendations, and that's not going to be until after one of our voting meetings.
Right.
And so people probably want to hear what they have to say, take into account their allocations, how to use affordable housing units. That probably flows into certain school discussions or allocations discussions, right? Both. And so it might make sense to have our first voting meeting only be about all the administrative things, like how often should we meet, or how do we label certain things? The things that aren't the big giant test things, right? Like we know they're gonna take up a lot more debate time when we get to talking about school percentage, what triggers a wait, how long should it be? I mean, those are probably the top two things we're gonna talk the longest about. New metrics might not be a long discussion, but it's a separate one. You could probably put several together. I mean, roads, new metrics, some administrative stuff, like maybe we could do that stuff first. I'm just throwing out there that I think that the school discussion is gonna be the most lengthy one. It has the most issues within it. And we should probably do that after hearing from them.
After hearing what, Lisa? I'm sorry.
On the 26th, the housing affordability recommendations, we were just told that they were going to be discussing with us their viewpoint on how the affordable housing allocations should be implemented, how they can be used. So that's a topic that we should likely debate after hearing from them.
The 26th of February or March?
March. I don't know, I hear what you're saying, I don't know if it'll be that critical though, just some of the recommendations, some of the topics that you all can begin discussing. I hear what you're saying, and I'm not disagreeing entirely, but I don't know if that's gonna be that critical to having some of those discussions at the next meeting.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing I would bring up too is, the importance of public feedback in having this hearing to everything that we do, because we could debate and we could have a vote, and then we have this public forum and people could come and comment on the issues that we've already had a vote and a tally on. And as committee members, we want to be able to take that feedback from the public and consider it in terms of the decisions that we're making, not just for one of us might change their mind based on that public feedback on something that we previously voted on, but also to the benefit of the public and the citizens who are coming out to provide that feedback. We should be considering it. So I guess I want to make sure that we're doing it in a way that thoughtfully ensures that, if we're voting on something, then we have public feedback on it, that we could take that feedback and either re-vote on it or.
Oh, absolutely.
How does that process work? Yeah.
Yeah, so the idea is you will be making your recommendations, taking your votes, coming up with your draft recommendations, going to public hearing from that, and then going back and saying, hey, we've heard from the public and, maybe we do want to change our minds. So then you can go back and say, do we want to make amendments to what we've already proposed based on the public feedback? And you can revise then your draft.
Okay, sounds good.
And then at the end, you would just make a final motion to say, hey, this is the plan that we're forwarding, the task force recommendation that we're forwarding to county council on such and such a date.
Okay, so even if we voted on something and then we got this feedback from this affordability working group, then we could go back based on that feedback, just as we go back based on any other public forum feedback as well.
Okay.
If I can offer a contrary view of the order of things, whenever I've had to set up meeting agendas, you put the hardest issues first. And I agree with Lisa that the schools are the hardest issue. And rather than have it get short shrift because we spend a lot of time on administrivia, I'd say dive in with it. Let people get their ideas on paper and let's just tackle all of them up front, because you're right, it's going to be a tough conversation.
That's a good point. You don't want to wish you had more time on the hardest things.
Let's start with, getting your thoughts together, your list together for Linda by the 28th. Let's go from there. We've got to start with something, so let's start with that and get those out there, and then we'll work accordingly.
Okay.
I would add for visibility, and we kind of did this in the last APFO committee. We got a pretty significant Excel spreadsheet with lots of suggestions. If we do want to sideline something because it's duplicative, sideline it, but still keep it publicly available. I'll give you a wild example. We want to do a heliport at Meriwether Post Pavilion for rock stars, or we want to do a heliport at Meriwether Post Pavilion for emergency trauma patients. Still a heliport, but one has a completely different intent than the other. If we were to do one or the other, it would do a disservice to the recommendation. I would appreciate, they don't have to be a book, but just the one-liner, what the intent was for the various things that either made the list.
Do you want me to send a template to you? I made a template already. Do you want me to send the template for you all to fill out to use for your parking lot items or?
That would probably help all of us if we're working on the
Is
same
that not a
file.
collaborative
Yeah, I
document
guess we
that
could.
you can send out?
That'd be great.
Is that link to the template not a collaborative document that we all see at once and tap on, that you don't have to later merge all into one, or is that separate documents?
I don't know if I can give you all access to, I have to
Okay.
see, I'll check with I don't know if I have access to share our SharePoint outside of
Fair.
county government. So that's what I would need to check on.
Yeah, there's pros and cons. You could have somebody mention something, you go, I don't have to mention it, and then they remove it, and then it's
Mhm.
gone, so. we
It's
probably
version
will.
control. It's version controlled on SharePoint. You don't have that problem per se. That's
Yeah, I don't,
that would be an issue.
I would just have to check with our DTCS if I'm allowed to
Mhm.
to do that. I'm not 100% clear on that. So if I can, maybe we could do a SharePoint, or I could just share a spreadsheet and you all could use that as your template. I just need to check.
Anything else, Linda?
Yeah, that's all I have.
I'll just mention one other thing. The Spending Affordability Committee, we have to present our final report in the next 10 days, I think, and we're actually well into drafting and have voted already. So we'll be presenting to the county executive on Tuesday morning. We'll still be in draft form. We'll be voting though next week, Thursday. And as soon as that document is voted on and completed, I'll forward it to everybody. It's a lot of numbers and charts, but the first couple of pages will just be the executive summary. And if you do nothing else, just take a look at the executive summary, because that will have already been presented to the executive, and we're on the docket to present to the council, I think the week after that. So that may all happen before our next meeting, just so you know. But as soon as there's a final document, I'll get it to everybody. Anybody have anything else? We'll adjourn for the night and look forward to receiving your thoughts. So a motion to adjourn. Anybody?
Second.
You guys got a half hour back and
All
7
approved.
minutes.
All right, thanks, everybody. Have a great night.
47 minutes. All right, thank you. Enjoy. Bye-bye.